When I first met Emily, her world was the size of a single room. She was just 24 years old, but for the past 2 years, she'd been incapacitated by unrelenting panic attacks and overwhelming anxiety that had taken over her life and shrunk it beyond measure. She watched her friends' lives unfold on Instagram while hers stood still. The same four walls of her childhood bedroom, the same view from her window of a world she was afraid to access. Nights were the hardest. Before she could even lie down, she was compelled to go through a grueling series of rituals, washing, showering, bathing, checking, and repeating processes again and again, driven by the fear that something terrible would happen if she didn't. By the time she got to bed, it was often the early hours of the morning, her mind still racing. Needless to say, when I first met Emily, she was exhausted, isolated, and losing hope. And in our first session together, I remember handing her an invisible magic wand and asking her what she would wish for. Her dream was painfully simple. She just wanted to live a normal life. She dreamed of becoming a PE teacher and of seeing her friends again. But that normal life felt a world away. Sadly, Emily is not an outlier. This story, especially in our young people, is all too common. We're living through an unprecedented epidemic of mental illness. In the UK today, 1 in 4 adults has a mental health diagnosis. Tragically, suicide is the leading cause of death for people under the age of 35. And if that isn't enough, let's consider the cost. Estimated at £300 billion annually in England alone, with 18.5 million working days lost to poor mental health each year. There's no doubt we've done brilliantly at raising awareness. We're talking about mental health more than ever, and yet the rates continue to rise. But this isn't just about Emily. This is about you. You see, Emily's story is extreme, but the underlying biology is anything but unique. I would argue that many of us in this room are already experiencing the early red flags of a brain that's struggling. It shows up as the anxiety that wakes you up at 3 a.m. The short fuse you didn't used to have, the brain fog as you read through the same email for the third time. And for many, the stakes are even higher. We're watching an older generation, our parents and grandparents, slide into the long shadows of cognitive decline and dementia. We're taught this is inevitable, a slow, unstoppable rusting of the mind. But what if these conditions, the anxiety, the low mood, the brain fog, are not isolated conditions, but different points on the same biological spectrum? What if they are signals that the organ in our head is struggling to function? I believe that we are missing a really important piece of the puzzle. I'm here today to suggest that we have more leverage over our brain health than we've been led to believe, and the answers may not be where you think. So I'm Ruth Etches, a nutritionist and the founder of ReHealth, an international clinic dedicated to brain health. And you might be thinking, what's a nutritionist doing on a TED stage talking about mental health? Isn't that about thoughts and feelings, medications and talking therapies? I work in an exciting and emerging field called metabolic psychiatry, working alongside conventional psychiatric care. Metabolic psychiatry means something quite simple. It's actually looking at how the brain obtains and uses food, energy from the food in our diet, and how that affects how we think and feel. And I've seen that when we stop treating the mind as a mystery to be managed and we start treating the brain as an organ to be fueled, the results can be life-changing. But in order to get to those results, we first have to unlearn everything that we think we know about mental health. And we have to address the great divide that has shaped our medical system for centuries. You see, for years, we've thought of the mind, the home of our thoughts and feelings, as separate from the physical organ of our brain. Rationally, That doesn't make sense at all. But when you look at the medical system, it is the way it works. If you have a problem with your memory, you'll see a neurologist. A problem with your mood, you'll see a psychiatrist. For years, we have separated the mind from the body entirely. And in doing so, we've split human suffering into compartments. Since the 1960s, we've had access to the most extraordinary array of medications to treat mental health, and the range of therapies continues to grow. In most Western systems, the model looks a bit like this. You go to your doctor, you tell your doctor you feel depressed. Your doctor tells you you have depression. Bingo, a diagnosis. And whilst it can be helpful to have a name for the pain, a label isn't a map out of the woods. It's likely to lead to a prescription for an antidepressant, maybe talking therapies if you're lucky enough to get to the front of the long queue. Medication has become the mainstay of treatment. In the UK today, 1 in 6 adults is taking an antidepressant. And I want to be absolutely clear. For some, medication is essential. Medication can be life-saving. And I don't want to diminish our thoughts, our feelings, our life experiences and traumas. These are deeply real. But I do want to ask a question. If the current model were working at a population level, wouldn't we be seeing a decrease in mental illness? Instead, we see the opposite. As a nutritionist working in brain health, I believe we are missing a fundamental piece of the puzzle. Your brain is the most energy-hungry organ that you own. It weighs only about 2% of your body weight, and yet it consumes around 20% of your energy. Every thought, every feeling, every moment of self-control depends on a constant supply of energy. So let me ask a simple question. What happens when your brain's energy requirements are not met? When the brain doesn't get what it needs, it adapts. And those adaptations can look like low mood, anxiety, brain fog, different conditions, but maybe the same underlying distress. An organ running on empty, an engine under strain. And we know that when energy drops, function drops too. To understand why energy is dropping, it helps to look back. You see, genetically, we haven't changed much since Paleolithic times. We evolved to survive scarcity, to cycle between feasting and fasting. But today, in our crazy 21st century lives, many of us are living completely out of sync with our evolutionary biology. Eating many times a day, diets often very high in refined carbohydrates, sugar and fake foods. In essence, we are overfed but undernourished. And when we zoom out and look at large population studies, a clear pattern emerges. People who eat diets based on real whole foods have far lower rates of mental illness. But what's now emerging is it may not just be about the quality of the food. It may be about the brain-energy gap. This gap is what happens when your metabolic engine, your brain, is repeatedly flooded with glucose from the carbohydrates and sugars in your diet, but it stops being able to access that fuel effectively. It's a bit like flooding the engine of a car. And because your brain is the most expensive engine you own, it's the first place to feel the crash. Ultimately, I believe we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, we should be asking, why do you have it? And ultimately, is your engine struggling? And if one driver of mental illness could be metabolic, could be to do with brain energy, can we consider changing how the brain is fueled? For over 100 years, we've known that the brain can work on more than one fuel. In 1921, a new diet called the ketogenic diet was developed in order to treat children with severe epilepsy to help stabilize brain chemistry. This diet has been part of our medical toolkit for over a century. In simple terms, you're like a hybrid car. Most of the time, you're going to be powering on glucose from the carbohydrates in your diet. But when these are restricted, your body does something incredible. It turns to a different fuel source. And it starts using the fats in your diet and your own stored body fat to make something called ketones. And ketones, it turns out, are a remarkable fuel source. They're like rocket fuel for your brain, turning you from a gas-guzzling diesel into a brand new Tesla. Research has shown that the ketogenic diet can help to lower inflammation, reduce the internal rusting we mentioned earlier, and even modulate key neurotransmitters, messengers involved in our mood regulation. So what does this ketogenic diet look like in practice? A keto diet is a diet very low in carbohydrates, moderate in protein, and high in healthy fats, foods like nuts, seeds, olive oil, fatty fish, eggs, cheese. And I want to say something important here. A ketogenic diet, a medical ketogenic diet, is a medical intervention. It should be done under clinical supervision, especially if you're on medications or have a complex health history. But I also want to be clear that the ketogenic diet doesn't have to be complicated and it doesn't have to be expensive. Your body doesn't need a credit card to change fuels. You can even access this state through intentional windows of fasting alone. So whether you choose to enter a ketogenic state through a well-formulated whole foods diet or through intentional windows of fasting, the goal is the same: to give your brain a break from the constant flood of glucose. So this leads me to an interesting question. If this ketogenic diet can stabilize the electrical storms of an epileptic brain, could it be helpful in mental illness? We've actually known for quite some time that one driver of mental illness might be metabolic. In 1965, psychiatrist Dr. Abel Pacheco tested a radical new idea. He took 10 women with severe treatment-resistant schizophrenia. These were women for whom all treatments had failed. He put them onto a ketogenic diet, and the results were staggering. Within just 2 weeks, they'd entered clinical remission. Their symptom scores improved. This study pointed to a fascinating new idea that for some people, mental illness might not just be a brokenness of the mind. It could involve a metabolic component, one that changes as the brain's fuel source shifts. Sadly, though, this was 1965, the dawn of the golden era of pharmaceuticals. And as a tidal wave of new medications hit the market, research into metabolic interventions didn't just slow down, it was buried. For years, we chose the pill over the plate, and we're only now just realizing what we left behind. For almost 50 years, the silence was total, but in the last 15 years or so, the pilot lights have started flickering back on. In 2009, a single case report published details of a 70-year-old woman who'd had severe treatment-resistant schizophrenia her entire adult life since the age of 17. She had daily hallucinations and delusions, many attempts at suicide. She was put onto a ketogenic diet, and within just 8 days, she went into clinical remission. She was last followed up in 2019 and had stayed in clinical remission all of that time, as long as she stayed on the diet. Then, in 2017, psychiatrist from Harvard, Dr. Chris Palmer, published a study of 2 separate patients with severe treatment-resistant schizoaffective disorder. These patients had been ill for years, resistant to conventional treatment. Both dramatically improved on a ketogenic diet, with hallucinations and delusions rapidly reduced, also alongside metabolic improvements such as weight loss, improving blood pressure, and so on. We began to see reports of success of the ketogenic diet in major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and even binge eating disorder. These reports bubbling up from clinics all over the world. Then in 2022, French psychiatrist Dr. Albert Danon published a study of 31 inpatients with severe treatment-resistant mental illness. When he switched their fuel source to ketones, the results were, in the words of the researchers, unprecedented. 100% of the patients who stayed on the diet improved. 63% reduced their medications and 43% went into clinical remission. And just last year, at the University of Edinburgh, under Dr. Ian Campbell, a pilot study into the use of the ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder showed that for these patients, a ketogenic diet could help with mood and energy. And the results of this study were so compelling that they've led to the launch of a new UK research and innovation hub for metabolic psychiatry in the UK, with large studies finally underway. We are no longer looking at fringe anecdotes. We're seeing a shift from what if to how fast. As I stand here today, most of what I've shared is small-scale studies. We urgently need those bigger studies. But I think of Emily, and I think of the millions of others like her that are suffering. And I would argue we don't have time to wait for these larger-scale studies. Does it not make sense right now to start fueling the metabolic engine of the brain and using food as medicine? Using a well-formulated diet means that we're moving the brain's fuel source, giving it the high-octane fuel that it needs to repair itself. If we want to stabilize the mind, we can no longer afford to ignore the engine that powers it. In Emily's case, we didn't just look at her thoughts and her feelings. We looked at her fuel source. We checked and gently corrected her nutrient levels to give her brain the things that it needed, the raw materials it needed, and we moved her towards that clean, ketogenic fuel source. Within weeks, the noise in Emily's mind started to quieten. The rituals became shorter. She started to be able to go to sleep earlier. And then came the wins. First, a drive with her mum, then coffee with a friend, and then came the big one. She applied for a job at her old school and she was invited for an interview. This process required her to put on a lanyard, something that months earlier would have been impossible due to fears of contamination, but she clipped it around her neck. And as she walked along the school corridors, she found herself opening the doors along the way. She wasn't thinking about germs anymore, she was just walking. Months earlier, Emily's world had been a single room. Now the doors were literally opening in front of her. Today, Emily is a teaching assistant in that very school, and this September, she starts her official teacher training. Emily didn't get her future back because we fixed her personality. She got it back because we bridged the brain energy gap. Emily didn't need a magic wand. She just needed the right fuel. Thank you.